So in today's presentation, I'm going to be using, as I said, some of the images from the HES archives and to explore some of the historic sites in Glasgow and also kind of around Glasgow in the west of Scotland as well. By using archive photographs and architectural plans and drawings and engravings and more, we can examine how these castles, churches and forts have changed over time. And we can illustrate some of the stories associated with these sites. The historic sites we'll be focusing on today are all cared for by HES, the organisation that I work for. But what is HES? In case you aren't familiar with our work, I'll just start by giving you a brief introduction. Historic Environment Scotland is the lead public body established to investigate, care for and promote Scotland's historic environment. We are a charity dedicated to the advancement of heritage, culture, education and environmental protection. We're responsible for maintaining hundreds of historic sites across Scotland. These include Edinburgh Castle, Stirling Castle, sites all across Scotland, and in Glasgow and the Glasgow area includes St Mungo's Cathedral, Dumbarton Castle, parts of the Antonine Wall, and more. We also care for an archive of literally millions of items, including 19th century photo albums, architectural drawings, archaeological reports, and more things as well. Much of this material has been digitized and can be viewed for free on our Canmore website. So the HES archives are a great way to explore historic sites around Scotland, and potentially in your area as well. The images and the physical items that we hold can help you see how buildings and sites have changed over time, and can also allow you to zoom in to see fine detail or zoom out to see the big picture. The image on the screen with the bookshelves shows our search room at John St Clair House in Edinburgh, and anyone can make an appointment to visit our search room in order to view material in our collections. And you can find details about that on our Canmore website and find out how to make an appointment. The other image on the screen shows a former colleague of mine having some fun examining some glass lantern slides using a light box. So the HES archives are full of all sorts of different material, and I'll just take some time now to show you some examples of the range of what we hold and how it can be useful when studying local history around Scotland or the history of a building. So we hold a large amount of aerial photographs. These include the aerofilms collections, and these were aerial photographs partly taken for commercial reasons, and there are photographs in the aerofilms collection from the 1920s up to the more recent past. We also hold survey aerial photographs that were taken by the Royal Commission for Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland, or ARCAMS, and still taken by colleagues in HES today, in fact. And these photographs include views of cities from different angles and decades. And you can see from these photographs of the same area of the Clyde as it runs through Glasgow, how much an area can change over time. Quays are filled in, what was industrial becomes residential. A bridge now allows pedestrians and vehicles to cross over the river at the same point that the tunnel linked by the rotundas would have once allowed pedestrians and vehicles to cross under the river. Aerial survey was also undertaken in order to aid with archaeological investigation. And you can see from these images how aerial photographs taken with certain light or in certain weather conditions and from certain angles can give you a clear view of a site such as a fort. We also hold a variety of different historic photographs. The photograph of the car is from a photograph album, and the image of Wemyss Bay railway station is a postcard that we hold. While the material we hold was generally collected to help with research into architecture and archaeology, you can see from the images on screen how they can also be useful if you're studying other subjects such as the history of travel or tourism or leisure. The image with the car is a very dynamic photo of a car rally in progress in 1905, probably in Glasgow and probably somewhere near Great Western Road. But we'd welcome anyone who can provide a more detailed identification to provide that. There are also a large amount of illustrations and engravings in our collections, and these include individual prints and illustrations from rare books. These are obviously important as snapshots of locations prior to the invention of photography, as with the John Slee's illustration of Dumbarton Castle there. And illustrations and engravings also allow aspects of architecture and design to be highlighted in a way that might be missed in a photograph. This is useful also for anyone undertaking reconstruction of a historic property. We hold a large amount of architectural drawings of buildings and structures across Scotland, including designs for cottages, bridges, cinemas, stately homes, factories, and everything in between. These drawings can show you the bones of a building, the toilets and the gas pipes and everything else. But they can also show you the architect's perfect vision for a building, the version that they show to the client. And these drawings include designs for buildings that never were, and alternative designs for buildings that turned out differently, such as this competition design for the Kelvingrove Museum and Art Gallery. The drawings also show in great detail buildings which have since been demolished, such as this section drawing of a theatre and music hall in the former Milton Arcade in Cowcaddens. If architectural drawings show what could be or what would be, survey drawings, such as these, show what remains or seek to reconstruct what there was. These are measured technical drawings created of buildings and archaeological sites by colleagues in HES and other researchers. And survey drawings can show a clean and detailed image of an object or a building and do not rely on specific lighting in the same way that a photograph does. This is particularly useful with features which may have become worn away and indistinct over time. Survey drawings also allow the illustrator to create a cross-section, allowing the viewer to lift the lid off a building, something which obviously cannot be done with a photograph. So as you can see, we hold a large variety of visual material, and these can be used for lots of different aspects of research. So we're now going to look at some sites managed by HES in and near Glasgow, and the first site that we'll be looking at is Newark Castle, Port Glasgow, not to be confused with other Newark castles in Scotland or indeed England. So here we can see Newark Castle from two different angles and from two different times, from the southwest in 1939 and the southeast in 2005. It's a castle in two or perhaps three parts. The square keep tower dates from the 15th century. The fortified gatehouse that you can see in the black and white photograph is perhaps from the same period or perhaps later, and the section connecting the tower with the gatehouse is late 16th century. And this is a clear example of a fortified defensive structure morphing into more of a prestigious decorative mansion. So here you can see the castle in an engraving produced by Robert William Billings, the 19th century antiquarian artist and architect. This illustration would have appeared in Billings's book, The Baronial and Ecclesiastical Antiquities of Scotland, a publication full of similar illustrations of similar buildings, analysing and presenting the Scottish baronial style of architecture. This style, partly due to Billings and partly due to people like Sir Walter Scott, became hugely popular in 19th century Scotland, and it drew liberally from Scotland's built environment and also from 19th century ideas of the Scottish past. The image shows Newark Castle in the middle of the 19th century, and you can see some features from the late 16th century mansion, which were such a feature of the 19th century revival or the reinvention of Scottish baronial, such as the corner turrets with corbelling, which is the round section at the bottom of the tower. And you can also see that this was a popular spot for dog walkers 150 years ago, as it is now. The images here show the ducat of the castle, and this was built as a defensive tower and marked the corner walls enclosing the castle. It was later, however, converted into a ducat. And you can see some wonderfully preserved patterning on the painted ceiling beams inside the castle here as well. The first castle on the site was built by George Maxwell in the 1480s. King James IV once briefly stayed with George at Newark Castle in 1495, and the River Clyde was a key reason for this royal visit. James IV had been travelling from Dumbarton towards the Hebrides in order to receive the allegiance of nobles there. In the 1590s, Sir Patrick Maxwell inherited the castle and carried out extensive building work, which produced a thoroughly modern Renaissance mansion. This version of the castle, minus wear and tear, is what we see today. Sir Patrick even signed his work, and the interlinked initials of Sir Patrick Maxwell and his wife, Lady Margaret Crawford, PMC, adorn the pediments to the doors and the windows of the new mansion. The inscription above the doorway that you can see there reads, "The blessings of God be herein." However, this was not a happy house or a happy marriage. Sir Patrick was a violent man. He feuded with his neighbours, and his own mother complained about him to the Privy Council. Lady Margaret was abused by her husband, and in 1636 appealed to the Privy Council for protection against her cruel and unnatural husband. She eventually left for Dumbarton, although not before giving birth to 16 children. In 1668, the Clyde again played a part in the story of Newark Castle, when the castle and the surrounding land were sold to the city of Glasgow in order to build a new navigable harbour, named Newport Glasgow, on the Clyde for the city merchants. This was required as the Clyde near to Glasgow had become too silted to allow the passage of the large ocean-going vessels increasingly used by Glasgow merchants to engage in trade with the New World. And the engraving here shows Port Glasgow as a hub of maritime activity in the 19th century. And you can also see some extracts from the image there showing the different kind of ships plying their trade on the Clyde at this time, including steamers and, of course, tall ships as well. Partly because of this harbour and the international connections, from the 18th century, Port Glasgow also became a hub of shipbuilding, and yet Newark Castle survived in the midst of all these shipyards. Here you can see Port Glasgow from the air in 1953. You might not be able to see Newark Castle amongst all the shipbuilding activity, but I've also provided a zoomed-in version of this photograph in the middle, where you might just about be able to make out the castle surrounded by cranes, sheds, and indeed ships. And you can see that things are quietened down in the modern period in the colour photograph, although the castle's nearest neighbour, of course, is still Ferguson Marine. Another neighbour of Newark Castle across the water is Dumbarton Castle, the buildings of which are nestled along Dumbarton Rock. Dumbarton Rock juts out into the Clyde, and its importance as a defensive position was recognised from an early date. It seems to have been fortified from the 5th century onwards, and maybe the Alt Clwt, meaning Rock of the Clyde, mentioned by the Venerable Bede as the centre of the Kingdom of Strathclyde. The photographs of the object here show cross slabs from the 10th century, which were excavated at Dumbarton Castle, showing how long this site has been occupied. In 870, Vikings, led by Olaf the White, King of Dublin, and Ivar Beinlaus, the Crippled, besieged Alt Clwt for 10 months, eventually carrying off treasure and prisoners. On screen, you can see an artist's impression of that siege, obviously based on research, but still just a suggestion of how things might have looked. You'll be able to see artists' impressions like this in guidebooks, on interpretation panels, at HES Properties in Care, and of course other historic sites as well. And digital versions of these images can be accessed on our Scran website and can be useful for interpreting or imagining historic sites, particularly for a younger audience. But they can also be a useful way to orient yourself when considering how a site might have looked or might have been used in the past. For the next few hundred years, until the 13th century, Dumbarton would be a frontier stronghold on the border between the Kingdom of Scotland and the Kings of Norway. Throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern period, Dumbarton would continue to be a strategically important castle, both in struggles between Scotland and England, and also in internal conflicts within Scotland. Someone working for Henry V of England described Dumbarton Castle as a castle strong and hard for to obtain. The portcullis arch shown in the photograph is a surviving part of the medieval fortifications, and these also included the remains of the so-called Wallace Tower, which can be seen today by the building known as the French Prison. The fortifications were extended and modernised following the 1715 Jacobite Rising, and the imposing main entrance to the castle and the governor's residence, shown in the photograph, were added in the 1720s and 1730s. After the Jacobite Rising of 1745, several Jacobite leaders were imprisoned at the castle, including one of the 7 men of Moidart, Aeneas MacDonald. The plan on screen is a Board of Ordnance survey plan, a Board of Ordnance plan of Dumbarton Castle, showing how it would have looked by the 19th century. And the castle remained an important defensive position during the Napoleonic Wars. As well as Vikings and prisoners of war, Dumbarton Castle has also had plenty of other visitors, including Samuel Johnson and James Boswell, when they took their tour around Scotland. In his published account of their journey, James Boswell wrote that, "We stopped at Dumbarton, and though the approach to the castle there is very steep, Dr. Johnson ascended it with alacrity and surveyed all that was to be seen." The painting on the screen is from the collections of West Dumbartonshire Council and is one of the items which is available to view on Scran. Now, Scran has resources from organisations and collections all over the UK. And this painting shows Queen Victoria visiting Dumbarton Castle in 1847. And if you would like to view this image or other images on Scran, then you can register for a free account to do so with Scran. You can obtain that by contacting us at archives at hes.scot. During the same visit to Scotland, the Queen and her family saw the castle from the ferry, which was the Royal Steamboat. In her journal entry for that day, Victoria wrote that they saw Dumbarton Castle, the situation of which is very fine, the rock rising straight out of the river, with mountains all around, and the town of Dumbarton behind it. It is very picturesque. And on screen, you can see a photograph of the castle from the 1860s, so around 10 to 15 years after Queen Victoria's visit. Travelling down the Clyde into Glasgow now, here we see St Mungo's Cathedral. Now, there has been a Christian site at the location of the present cathedral since the 6th or 7th century, when a monastery was founded by St Kentigern or St Mungo. The building was built, rebuilt, and expanded throughout the Middle Ages, reaching its current shape in the 15th century. It survived the Reformation better than other Scottish cathedrals and was repaired and remodeled during the 19th century. Here we can see the wonderful carved stone choir screen dating from the 15th century, and the photograph shows the west face of the choir screen and shows 5 figures holding scrolls. And this stone screen, pretty much a wall, essentially blocks the choir of the cathedral off from the nave. The Blackadder aisle is shown in the other photograph. This is from 1949, this photo. This was named because it was commissioned by Robert Blackadder in the late 15th century. Robert Blackadder was the last bishop of Glasgow and the first archbishop of Glasgow, as the elevation of the see happened during his prelacy. Also known as the Blackadder Crypt, it may have been intended to house relics associated with St Mungo. The stained glass windows by the altar that you might just be able to see there in the photograph are some of the 19th century Munich glass windows, later removed and replaced, but we'll talk more about those later. Along with religious scenes, there are also carvings and stained glass windows depicting coats of arms in the cathedral. And these would be for people connected with the cathedral, such as members of the clergy, or for patrons of the cathedral. The left coat of arms, with the fish and the ring on the bottom, is the coat of arms of Archbishop James Beaton. His initials are on either side. A J was often shown as an I. And Beaton was Archbishop during the time of the Reformation in Scotland, and later, when he had fled to Paris, he acted as Mary Queen of Scots' ambassador to France. The other image there, the illustration, is a drawing of civic coats of arms at the cathedral, a drawing that we hold. So here we can see on the left a Glasgow Library's image on Scran, a 1791 lithograph showing the defence of the cathedral from being razed during the Reformation. And you can see on the right the cathedral from the same angle in a photograph from the 1930s. And this offers some insight into how the cathedral had changed, notably the removal of the towers at what is now the entrance to the cathedral, and the addition of the Royal Infirmary and the necropolis to join the cathedral, of course, as well. This photograph shows the cathedral as part of a public square, still serves now, like other cathedrals and grand churches. Uh, there's a sign there on the railings in this 1930s photograph, which advertises organ recitals. And actually, if you were to view this image on Canmore, we have a function which allows you to zoom in on images, so you would be able to zoom in and view that sign. One of the interesting stories of St. Mungo's Cathedral in the 19th century city is that of the Munich glass. In the 19th century, a general effort to restore and refurbish the cathedral was made, and part of this included restoring stained glass to the windows. Controversially at the time, it was decided that rather than using a Glaswegian, Scottish, or even British company, the windows would be commissioned from the Königliche Glasmalerei Anstalt, or the Royal Bavarian Stained Glass Works in Munich. These windows were created and installed in the mid-19th century, but were removed in the mid-20th century, partly due to the effects of pollution in Glasgow at the height of its industrial period. This glass was not destroyed or lost, however. It is held and cared for by HES still. Munich glass can still be seen in one of the high windows of the cathedral near the nave, and some of the Munich glass was cleaned and restored and is currently on display in exhibition frames in the crypt of the cathedral. On the left, you can see a cropped section of a 1949 black and white photograph of the Blackadder Isle. That's the one we saw before. And we can see in this photo some Munich glass when in place. And next to that, you can see the color photograph of the same window after that has been restored after having been removed. The remaining glass is still in storage, so the best way that you can see this in its illuminated glory is to look at the images available on the Scran website and on the HES Collections website as well. You can see some of these examples on screen. As the Royal Bavarian Stained Glass Works was destroyed in the Second World War, this also comprises an extraordinarily complete collection of this type of Munich glass. And this is one way in which digital archive collections can be so important. They allow fragile items such as stained glass or glass negatives or glass slides or rare books or delicate drawings to be viewed safely by far more people than would be possible if they were being handled constantly in an archive. Obviously, there is a good deal of more modern stained glass in the windows of the cathedral today. Although in some of the windows, particularly those with coats of arms, you will still be able to see an inscription saying that they replace the Munich windows. The photograph here shows the roof rafters of the cathedral exposed in the 1950s while the roof was being repaired. And you can zoom in to see the men working at height here. In our catalogue, this photo just has the description view of rafters. It doesn't mention the workmen at all. You have to look for that. It shows the importance of seeing material for yourself and not just relying on written descriptions because it only tells part of the story. It also shows how archive images of historic sites and spiritual sites can also be useful to people studying engineering or to people studying the history of work or the history of workplace safety, in fact. Along with the cathedral, Crookston Castle is one of the oldest surviving buildings in Glasgow, unless you count excavated Roman structures. The name comes from a Robert Croc, hence Croc's Tun, who was granted land here in the 12th century, and the remaining earthworks upon which the current castle sits are from the original castle built by Robert Croc, and the image shows the seal of Robert Croc there. By the 15th century, the castle had become property of a branch of the Stuarts, and the stone tower house was probably built by Sir Alexander Stuart. In the late 15th century, the Stuarts took part in an uprising against James IV, and the castle was besieged this time. It may possibly have been attacked by Monsmeg, which was wheeled from Edinburgh. Crookston Castle also featured in Sir Walter Scott's book The Abbot, where it became the location for the courtship between Mary Queen of Scots and Lord Darnley. Although this probably did not take place at Crookston in reality, at one point in The Abbot, Mary Queen of Scots watches the Battle of Langside from Crookston, and Scott acknowledged in a footnote that this was not really the location that Mary had watched the battle from, but he felt that that made for a better story due to his belief that Mary already had a personal connection to the castle. In the book, Scott described Crookston as a castle which, crowning a gentle yet commanding eminence, presented an extensive view over the country beneath, and in particular, commanded a view of those heights which both armies hastened to occupy. You can see two views of Crookston Castle that were made in the 1830s here, shortly after the publication of the Abbot. The image on the left emphasizes the high position of Crookston and the commanding views that could be obtained from it, as referenced just there. And the image on the right shows Crookston Castle as a romantic ruin. The Maxwells of Pollock acquired the estate in the 18th century, and in 1931, Sir John Stirling Maxwell, pictured, gifted the castle to the National Trust for Scotland, and that was the first property owned by the National Trust for Scotland. Crookston was then transferred from the National Trust for Scotland into state care in 1963. The central image there shows some graffiti from 1942, in fact from Christmas Eve 1942, and this was when the tower housed an anti-aircraft battery during the Second World War. Now, this rather forbidding-looking character on the right is the custodian of Crookston Castle in 1974, when it was in state care, and you can see he's got some ferocious dogs there as well. So now we move on to the Antonine Wall. The Antonine Wall was, at the time of its construction and its use, the most northerly frontier of the Roman Empire, for a time replacing Hadrian's Wall as the northern border. It was constructed in AD 140, but was only in use for around 20 years before being abandoned in favour of Hadrian's Wall. It therefore offers a snapshot of Roman engineering, social life, and political intentions from a particular point in time. The wall stretched from Scotland, across Scotland, from Old Kilpatrick to the Firth of Forth. The wall, for the most part, was constructed with a stone base and turf ramparts on top of that. This turf wall was accompanied by a ditch on the north side and the military road on the south, showing that it served the dual function, control of the border and allowing for communication along that border. The map on screen shows the Antonine Wall and photographs of sites associated with it near Dundalk, as well as a carved stone from the fort at Rough Castle, commemorating and celebrating the building of that fort. There were almost 20 forts along the Antonine Wall. One of the best preserved and most researched of these is Rough Castle near Falkirk. Now, of course, Rough Castle isn't really a site near to Glasgow or in Glasgow, but the Antonine Wall stretches across the central belt, and this is an example of the sort of structure that would have been found closer to Glasgow as well. You can see some details of the fort in the reconstruction plan on the screen, such as the ditch in front of the wall and the military way. This plan was drawn in 1958 for inclusion in the inventory of monuments for Stirlingshire, published in 1963 by the Royal Commission on Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland. When used in conjunction with this publication, the figures on this plan make sense. And they show that the fort itself would have included a headquarters building, a granary, and a commandant's house, with a bathhouse in the annex to the right of the fort. If you're not able to put your hand on a physical version of this publication, these inventories have been digitized and can be downloaded or viewed for free as PDFs on the Canmore website. This plan also makes reference to Lilia, and these are the pits that you can see in the photograph there. They would have been dug to the north of the wall and filled with spikes to deter attacking forces. It's a belt and braces approach, similar to putting barbed wire in front of a modern wall. And here we can see a section of the wall closer to Glasgow, the excavated bathhouse at Bearsden. The cross-shaped bathhouse and latrine would have been in an annex attached to a fort, similar to Rough Castle, and it was constructed from stone and timber. The bathhouse included a changing room, a cold room, 2 warm rooms or tepid area, a hot room or coldarium, and a sauna or sudatorium. A large amount of pottery was found at the site, and we even know what was eaten from these vessels. Archaeologists and scientists studying the sewage found at the bathhouse also encountered evidence of the soldiers' diet, mostly plants. This is a fascinating view of the everyday life of the people who lived and worked along the Antonine Wall, and reminds us, of course, that monuments like this are not merely military relics or lines on a map, but places where real people lived and continue to live. So the Antonine Wall has been researched and excavated at various points throughout the 20th century and is now a UNESCO World Heritage Site as part of the frontiers of the Roman Empire, along with Hadrian's Wall and the Limes in Germany. Interest in the wall stretches further back than this. One person to research the Antonine Wall in particular was Major General William Roy. So Roy was born in 1726 in Lanarkshire, and the trigonometry points shown in the photograph records his place of birth. In the middle of the 18th century, he carried out work as part of the military survey in Scotland, and the Roy maps, as they are now known, are an invaluable tool for people researching Scotland from this period. You can browse these maps on the Crown website. Now seen as the founder of the Ordnance Survey, Roy was also a keen antiquarian, and his Military Antiquities of the Romans in Northern Britain was published in 1793, shortly after his death. And you can see one of the wonderful plates from that publication on screen. It's a very long fold-out plan of the Antonine Wall, over 1.5 meters in length when it's unfolded. Roy was, of course, a military man, and his survey of Scotland from 1747 must be seen in the context of the British state seeking to bring the Highlands under control following 1745. Roy wrote that it will appear evident that what, with regard to situation, was an advantageous post when the Romans were carrying on their military operations in Britain, must, in all essential respects, continue to be a good one now, proper allowances being made for the differences of arms and other changes which have taken place between the two periods. That is, an understanding of how the Romans sought to control Scotland could also be of value to the modern military reader in the 18th century. Since the Roman period and since the time of Roy, the Antonine Wall has been joined by the Forth and Clyde Canal, and now, of course, is an excellent route to travel on by foot, bike, or indeed boat. So here we have Bothwell Castle, which until recently was closed for a while for conservation works, masonry repairs, but is now open again for this season, although there are some parts that are still inaccessible to the public. This castle was built by the Murray family beginning in the 13th century, and the castle changed hands between England and Scotland numerous times during the Scottish Wars of Independence. In 1297, it was successfully besieged by a Scottish army for over a year, but was recaptured by the English shortly afterwards. In 1337, Bothwell was retaken from the English by Sir Andrew Murray, and he carried out demolition works to make the castle less useful to the enemy forces. Through marriage, Bothwell later changed hands from the Murrays to the Douglas family, and Archibald the Grim started rebuilding the castle, adding a rectangular tower house which no longer stands. On screen, you can see a carved Douglas coat of arms in the wall at Bothwell Castle, although, of course, worn away slightly, and a colour illustration of that crest for comparison. Here we can see two views of the donjon, one of the most impressive remaining parts of the castle. The donjon, or the keep, was intended to be the family lodging for the Murrays, and was also designed to be defended. Its walls were over 4 meters thick, and would have been even more imposing before it was partially demolished in the 14th century. The engraving on the left was published in the 1770s, and the glass lantern slide on the right is from the first half of the 20th century. Seeing these images alongside each other, it's remarkable how little the donjon has changed during that time, testament perhaps to the strength of the walls. On screen here, you can see two views of the round tower, so not the donjon, a different part, at Bothwell, and the left is from 1763, and the right photograph is from the 1860s, so 100 years apart from each other, but again showing a scene unchanged largely except for the plant growth. So Bothwell Castle may not have changed much during this time, but the world around it certainly had. At the bottom of the engraving, we can see the words "View from the West Castle of Bothwell" and "Sea Coordinate" and Academy, Glasgow, November 29th, 1763. So the artist here is Charles Cordner, who studied at the Fowlis Academy in Glasgow from 1763 to 1766. The view was engraved by Robert Paul, also at the Academy. Cordner later became a minister in Banff, but didn't lose his interest in art or antiquarianism. And in the 1770s, he produced some drawings of historic sites on behalf of Thomas Pennant, and these were published in Antiquities and Scenery of North Scotland. Cordner also published Remarkable Ruins and Romantic Prospects of North Britain, which he worked on with the engraver Peter Mazel. In the 18th century, the relationship between artist and engraver, sometimes the same person, was necessary to translate a drawing or a painting into a medium which could be consumed by more people. By the 19th century, of course, there was a new way to mass produce images: photography. The right-hand photograph was taken by Thomas Annan. Annan had actually started his career as an engraver before becoming an early proponent of photography in the mid-19th century. He lived and worked in Glasgow, and as well as taking artistic photographs of romantic locations like Bothwell, he also documented the slums of Victorian Glasgow. So these three photographs of Bothwell Castle are from the 1860s and are from an album in our collections, photographs of Lanarkshire scenery. And you can see here some posed photographs of women with a rake and a hoe, not croquet sticks as I initially thought, and a reclining man reading something. In the photographs, you can again see the donjon and the round tower. And in the album itself, these photographs are shown along with a view of Bothwell Castle on the same page. And you can see from this album and from the variety of engravings of Bothwell Castle, and as we will later see, Craignothon Castle, that the castles and ruins of Lanarkshire in this period held appeal to antiquarians, artists, and travellers. This is partly to do with the romantic setting of crumbling medieval ruins nestled along the banks of the Clyde, and the connection that these sites had to Scott and the Scottish Wars of Independence and Mary Queen of Scots, and also must have been related to the relative ease for most people of visiting these sites as opposed to venturing into the Highlands or the islands. Other visitors to Bothwell and nearby sites included Wordsworth and Coleridge. Wordsworth wrote, "Immured in Bothwell's towers, at times the brave, so beautiful is the Clyde, forgot to mourn the liberty they lost at Bannockbourne." So here we have Castle Semple Collegiate Church near Lochwinnoch. The church was founded and endowed in 1504 by John I Lord Semple, who was an ally of James IV, he'd been made a lord thanks to his military support of the crown. And the establishment here also included a grammar school. When first built, the church would have been rectangular in shape, and the polygonal apse that you can see in the aerial photograph was added by one of Lord Semple's descendants. On screen here, you can see on the left the elaborate tomb within the church, into which the first Lord Semple was laid to rest in 1513, after meeting his end at the Battle of Flodden. This church was founded and endowed with the express idea that the clergy saying masses here would help those buried here move through purgatory and onto heaven. And it's not surprising that this would be on the mind of a military man such as the first Lord Semple. He presumably felt that he was making a sound investment for the future of his soul. However, the best laid schemes of mice and men go after Gley, and in 1560 the Reformation Act in Scotland led to the closure of the church as an ecclesiastical site. It would remain a burial site and was subdivided for this purpose. And on the right you can see a gravestone with some lovely lettering to a member of the Semple family who was buried here in 1587. In the 1720s, the estate was published by Colonel William McDowell I. William McDowell owned a sugar plantation and had made his fortune, like so many other Glasgow merchants, thanks to the buying, selling, and transporting of slaves. When he returned to Scotland, McDowell made his Glasgow home in Shorefield Mansion, shown on the left. But a man of his wealth, of course, also needed a country estate, so he purchased the Castle Semple estate in 1727. In 1726, the year before he bought the estate, McDowell had purchased the slave ship, but it overturned on its voyage from Africa, drowning almost 300 enslaved Africans. McDowell's son and grandson continued to use the wealth gained from sugar and slavery to improve Castle Semple. The first Lord Castle Semple's castle was demolished and was replaced with a mansion by the McDowells. You can see this house as it stood in the 19th century in the engraving on the top right there. And then you can see the mansion later on in this photograph from the 1960s, and its overgrown and ruined state shortly before it too was demolished. In 1949, Castle Semple Collegiate Church was brought into state care. The internal walls, which had subdivided it, were taken down. And on screen, you can see a photograph of the church in 1948. This photograph was taken as part of the work of the Scottish Development Department, their Historic Buildings and Monuments Division, and this is the predecessor to Historic Scotland. If we analyse the photograph more closely, we can see some interesting things. We can see the men working at height, as with the cathedral, perhaps to repair stonework. We can see the box with a strap on the grass, perhaps belonging to the photographer who took the picture. In the distance, we can see the octagonal folly on the hill, the so-called temple added to the estate by the second William McDowell. So here we have Craignethan Castle, which is, unlike Bothwell, this is still closed for conservation works. If the defining feature of Bothwell is its thick-walled round donjon, then undoubtedly the highlight of Craignethan Castle is its imposing square tower house. Like Bothwell, Craignethan sits on the heights overlooking a river, although in this case it's the Nethan rather than the Clyde. Seen from the air, you can see what attention was paid to straight lines and symmetry in terms of the walls and earthworks here, putting one more in mind of the later 17th century fortifications of Vauban in France. The castle was constructed in the 1530s by James Hamilton of Finnett, who was also appointed Master of Building Works Principal under James V, and oversaw building work for the Crown at Blackness, Linlithgow, and Stirling. Shortly after this, in 1540, Hamilton of Finnett was executed on grounds of treason, although it is not clear if these claims are justified, and if not, what the reason was for this fall from grace. The castle would then become part of the holdings of Finnett's half-brother, also James Hamilton, the second Earl of Arran, and then the second Earl's son, also James Hamilton, the third Earl of Arran. In 1579, the Scottish Privy Council ordered that the castle be cast down, be made less defensible. On screen here, you can see two of the Ordnance Survey index cards compiled by the Ordnance Survey, Archaeological Division. These cards were compiled by officer recorders in the Ordnance Survey and would also have notes added by field investigators. This work was undertaken by the Ordnance Survey between 1947 and 1983, after which point responsibility was transferred to the Royal Commission for Ancient Monuments for Scotland. And you can see from the cards on screen that these cards are the ancestors to the modern site records on the Canmore website, or Local Authority Historic Environment Records. I mentioned earlier that William Roy is considered the founder of the Ordnance Survey, so it is nice to think that the digital records you can search today on Canmore are, in a way, the great-great-great-grandchildren of the historical observations made by William Roy in the course of his survey work in the 18th century. The cards for the Craignethan Castle were compiled by the Ordnance Survey in 1958 and includes the note that the oldest part of the castle is undoubtedly the keep, and this is the castle immortalised by Sir Walter Scott as Tillytodlem Castle, an Old Mortality. Old Mortality by Walter Scott had been published in 1816, and in the book one of the characters asks, "What tower is that before us, rising so high upon that steep bank, out of the woods that surround it on every side?" In Old Mortality, the tower in question is Tillytodlem, but it was indeed claimed that Craignethan Castle was itself the inspiration for the fictional Tillytodlem. Scott himself was coy about whether he had intended this castle to be the model for Tillytodlem, or whether this was something that readers had arrived at by themselves. Nevertheless, the nearby village and railway station became named after the fictional castle, and Craignethan Castle became another stop on the Victorian Sir Walter Scott tourism trail. The drawings here are by Alexander Archer, an antiquarian artist from Edinburgh, and they're from the 1830s. Old Mortality had been first published in 1816, So by the time of this drawing, the connection between Tilly-Toddlem and Craignethin would have been made. And here are some more photos from the Lanarkshire Scenery album, which also featured Bothwell. And you can see how our collections and albums can be used to track the journey of particular photographers, antiquarians and tourists. And you can see what sort of places were of interest to travellers and readers from different periods. And that brings us to the end of our tour around Glasgow and the west of Scotland. You can view a lot of the images we've seen today on the Canmore website, but we also have images which can be viewed on our other web services, such as Scran, Britain from Above, and the National Collection of Aerial Photography, or NCAP. For anyone who is interested in viewing some of the original material which we hold in our physical archives, including photographs, engravings, drawings, not limited at all to properties in care, but in fact covering historic sites all across Scotland, that material is available to view in our search room in John Sinclair House in Edinburgh. Thank you.